Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing you my February reading wrap-up. Alright, so I had a pretty good, decent reading month in February. I'm starting to get back into the swing of things, I think. I read a total of 4 books, which isn't like a ton. It's honestly pretty average for me, but I also read like 30% of another book that I didn't finish. So I feel pretty good about that, especially because a couple of these books that I read in February were chunky. This is how my ratings panned out for February, and I'm really happy with that. I read 3 books that I rated 4 stars and 1 book that I rated 5 stars. I always love having at least one 5-star book a month, so I'm really happy with that. And then these are the 4 books that I read in February and that I will be talking about in today's wrap-up. So if you're only interested in my thoughts on some of these books, check out the timestamps in the description box and you can jump to whatever books you're most interested in hearing about. So in my monthly wrap-ups, I always talk about the books that I read in the order that I read them, and the very first book that I finished in February was Cibola by James S.A. Corey, and this is the 4th book in the Expanse series, which is a space opera science fiction series. I have really been enjoying the series, and I'm trying to read them pretty close together at this point, just because the 9th and final book of the series is coming out later this year, I think in October. So I think I'm shooting for reading one every other month. I read Cibola both in a paperback format, which I got out from my library. I already returned it. It was due back at the library. And also I had the audiobook, which I got from the library as well. And I really enjoyed the audiobooks for the Expanse books. I mean, the narrators aren't particularly memorable, so I can't say that it's the same narrator for all of the series or anything, but I typically do listen to the audiobooks and I enjoy them. Each of the Expanse books kind of, not that they stand alone, you definitely need to read them in order, but they do stand very well on their own. Like, I don't feel like you necessarily have to read them really close together. It's very episodic, which I think makes sense why it makes a really good TV show, which I have watched the first 2 seasons of the TV show and I'm really enjoying it. I'm in the middle of the 3rd right now. So this one, just like the previous Expanse books, contains some of the same characters. There's some like core characters that you're with and get point of views from, and then you get new point of views as well. And I think they do this in every book, but in this book in particular, there were some reoccurring characters, like one that came from the first book that I didn't even recognize was from the first book until I was watching season 1 of the show and his name popped up and I was like, oh, that guy, he's in the 4th book that I'm reading right now. And then there was someone from the 2nd book that popped back up. And then the prologue and the epilogue had little POVs from some of my favorite characters from the 2nd book, which honestly was a little disappointing because when I got that in the prologue, I thought they were going to be in this book, but you only get point of views from those 2 characters at the beginning and the end of the book. I really liked some of the new characters that were introduced. One of the characters is like this scientist, and they're basically going, trying not to be too spoilery, but they go to a planet to try and like colonize it. So there's a group of scientists that go and they're like studying the biology of the planet, which I found really interesting. I do have a bit of a science background in biology, so I always love seeing that in books, and that was one of the reasons why I enjoyed this book so much. But just like all the other ones, there's a lot of action, there's political intrigue, and I just think that they're a lot of fun. I had a hard time putting this one down. I constantly wanted to know what was going to happen next. In fact, I read this one, like I completed it before I finished the next book that I'm going to talk about, even though I started that one way before I started Cibola Burns, just because I needed to know what was going to happen and I just couldn't stop reading it. So I really enjoyed this one. As far as like out of the 4 Expanse books, I think it's my 2nd favorite. I think I enjoyed the 3rd one slightly more. I gave the 3rd one 5 stars and I'm pretty sure I gave the first 2 4 stars. This one I gave 4 stars, but it's definitely a high 4, like a 4.5 that I rounded down to 4. It just was a little bit underwhelming at the very, very end, but I still really enjoyed it, and I'm very much looking forward to the next installment in the series that I'm hoping to read in another month or 2. The next book that I finished, I actually have all 3 of the rest of the books that I read in physical format, which is exciting because that doesn't happen very often. But the next book that I finally finished, I started this one in January, is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. I did read this as a buddy read, sort of, with Leanna from Leanna's library. She like moved in the middle of reading this book and then hasn't really gotten a chance to get back to it, so we both took a long time to finish it, but I still finished it before her magically. Like, she usually is a book binger, and I didn't think that I would be finishing this before she did, but I did. This is one of Brandon Sanderson's earlier works. I knew that going into it, so I did have kind of like lower expectations, which I think is good because I think if you've read a lot of Sanderson, you don't want to hold this book up to quite the high standard. I mean, there's still a lot of really good stuff here. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I read this physically, as you can see. I got this from my library. I didn't have it in any other format, which was part of the reason why it took me so long to finish this book, but also because I was distracted by Cibola burn. I did still really end up enjoying the story. I gave it, it's a solid 4-star. There's not a whole lot that I can complain about it, but it's just also like knowing what other things I've enjoyed and the level of enjoyment I've gotten from other Sanderson works. This one just didn't quite meet that, but I also wasn't disappointed because I was kind of expecting that going in. I think the world building is super cool. I mean, Sanderson, he just makes really cool worlds, and I love the magic in this, and there's a little bit of like a mystery element because there's something about the magic or like this disease that's related to the magic that's not working correctly, and they're trying to figure out why. It has a really good opening chapter. Like, the opening chapter really hooked me. So there's a lot that I really loved about this. As far as like the things that I didn't love about it, some of the characters were a little annoying to me. They're just less complex than characters in some of his other works. They're less morally gray. The dialogue was a little clunky sometimes, or just like a little too on the nose for me. It just didn't sound like ways people really talk to each other, and there wasn't a lot of nuance. But other than that, I thought it was a really good time, and also there was a part that I like shed a couple of tears because something surprised me and I was emotionally connected with some of the characters and things. So there was a lot of things that I did really enjoy about this. I do recommend it. I just recommend, like, if you've read a bunch of other Sanderson, going in knowing that this is one of his earlier works, or also just like reading it earlier on in your Sanderson journey so you don't know like how amazing he could be, in my opinion. Obviously, not everybody thinks Sanderson's works are amazing, but I think if you read this earlier on in your Sanderson journey, it's more enjoyable. Or like, I think this is a really good book for like newbie fantasy readers who don't know a lot of what to expect, because there is a lot of what I would consider like hand-holding or explaining of things. It's just a little simple for fantasy compared to what I am used to reading, because I am not to do my own horn or anything, but I have read a lot of fantasy. So I do think it's a good like introduction to fantasy book. So yeah, I did really enjoy this. I'm glad to be able to say that I finally read this because I've read a lot of other Sanderson. It's just good to check that one off my list. Okay, the next book that I finished in February, I really enjoyed, and that was Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. I'm going to try not to get this to glare. This is an adult high fantasy. I obviously read it physically from my library, but I also listened to the audiobook, which is available on Scribd. I did a lot of listening while reading at the same time because I really enjoyed the audiobook, but I also was trying to read this really quickly because this was the Shelf Space book club pick for February. I will link the live stream that they did for Shelf Space down below. The first 20 minutes of it is spoiler free, and then they get into spoilers. And I had a lot of fun attending that live stream, as I always do, and that was one of the reasons why I picked this up, because while I had heard a lot of good things about it, I didn't love Rebecca Roanhorse's first book, her Trail of Lightning book, which is an urban fantasy. I think part of that was just a genre mismatch. I'm not a huge urban fantasy reader, but I'd heard a lot of good things about this, but it's the first book in a series, and you guys probably know how I feel about unfinished series. I try to avoid them just because I hate being left on a cliffhanger and not being able to continue on with the rest of the book, which is definitely what happened with this one. There's a lot of things that I loved about this book, which I'll talk about in a second, but my biggest hang up, and I think something that a lot of people will not appreciate about this book, is the way that it ends. It ends very abruptly, kind of like in the middle of a climax, and like things happen really quickly at the end and it wraps up really fast and just like it ends, and it's definitely a cliffhanger. I remember getting close to the end of the book being like, wait, there's not enough pages, like there's more stuff happening, like how does it end in like 10 pages? Like that doesn't make any sense. And sure enough, it ended really abruptly. That abrupt ending didn't ruin this book for me. I guess I didn't say, but I gave this one 5 stars. This was my 5-star read of the month. But because of that ending, it is more of like a 4.5 that I'm rounding up to 5, but there was just so much that I loved about it, and I had so much fun reading it. Like I could hardly put it down the whole time, and I read this really quickly for me, like within a week, which for some people is not fast, but it is fast for me, especially when I'm reading multiple things. So things that I loved about it, the world building. I'm a huge sucker for interesting world building. That's definitely something that got me in this book. The world is inspired by like pre-Columbia, but there's like gods, there's magic. There are like multiple cultures that are different from each other, which is super cool. There's definitely magical creatures. There are these like really big crows that like people, like some people ride, and that are like really intelligent. There are sirens in this world, which I was not expecting, and I thought that was super cool. I love the world building in this book. You get 3 POVs. 2 of them I loved. One of them I was kind of on the fence about. I didn't love her in the first half of the book, but in the second half, she got a lot more interesting. But I really loved the other 2 main characters and their like dynamic together. There's also some really good LGBTQ rep in here. Not only are there characters, there's like a woman who I believe is bisexual because she's attracted to both men and women, and that's like sort of accepted. I guess it depends on the culture, but that's in here. And then there's also a certain group of people who have a third gender that is neither male nor female, and they have their own pronouns, which I thought was super cool. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. It was a lot of fun. It's also kind of dark. The opening scene was super dark. Like I read that and I was like, whoa, okay, that's how we're starting this book. But like I said, it really hooked me, and I wanted to know why what happened in that first chapter happened. So I really enjoyed this. I can totally see why it's getting so much buzz. I just am so bummed that the ending was so abrupt and that there is no like news about the next book at all. Like I have no end in sight for when the next book is coming out, and I am dying. I need to know what's gonna happen next. I really enjoyed this, and I'm so glad that I read it. Okay, and then the last book that I finished in February, I did finish it a few days into March, but it was Barrow Rights by Hannah Kent. This is an adult historical fiction novel, and this was my Patreon book club pick for February. I'll have a link down below to my Patreon if you want to check the book club out. This one has been on my TBR, like my one-day TBR, for a long time. This is a fictional interpretation or a fictional story inspired by the real last woman in Iceland to be executed. It's my friend Elle, like one of her favorite books, and I've heard a lot of other people talk about it, so I had a lot of high hopes going into this. I had this physically paperback. I do own this. I picked it up at a library book sale. It's kind of beat up a little bit. And I also had the ebook out from my library, so I was switching back and forth between those 2 formats. And I ended up giving this a 4-star rating. I have to admit I was a little bit disappointed. I just didn't get all the feelings out of this book that I was expecting to get. So I'd say it's probably more of like a 3.5 that I rounded up. It was really interesting, and I learned a lot, which I always enjoy from historical fiction books. I just also, a lot of times with historical fiction books, really love getting like emotions out of it, like really emotionally connecting with characters, and a lot of times historical fiction books make me cry, and this one I was totally expecting that. I've heard that it's really emotional, and I'm someone who cries pretty easily, but for some reason I didn't emotionally connect with this. I think a lot of other people have emotionally connected with this and will emotionally connect with it, but for some reason there was some sort of disconnect for me, and I didn't cry at all. I mean, it was sad, and there's definitely some traumatic content in here, so I want to give content warnings for rape and also like childbirth and late-term miscarriage or like stillbirth, which I have to admit was pretty hard for me to read being currently pregnant right now. And then also like slaughter of farm animals is described, it can be kind of graphic. And that's one of the things that I appreciated about the book in some ways, in the sense that it really made me think about what it would have been like to live. I don't know what year this is. So this takes place in like the early 1800s, so like 1828, 1829. So it really made me think about what it would have been like to live back then, which is like not fun. I will say the book is very atmospheric. It made me feel cold sometimes, like the setting is very chilly. I can't say that it made me want to go to Iceland. Like, it just made it seem very dark and dreary and cold and a very hard place to live. I think maybe if I had been to Iceland before or was in Iceland when I was reading this, because I know my friend Elle, she was reading this when she was in Iceland, I think that would have made a big difference in my enjoyment of the book. But yeah, Iceland seems like a terrible place to live, at least in the early 1800s. And it just made me think about how hard it was to live back then as like a poor person, and especially as a woman. So yeah, this book gave me a lot to think about, and it was really interesting, but it was definitely not easy to read. It wasn't a fun read, which I wasn't expecting it to be fun. I just wish that I had emotionally connected a little bit more. There was also like a little bit of a mystery element, because I didn't say anything about what the book is about. The last woman in Iceland to be executed, while she's awaiting her execution, is sent to a family farm to work and stay there to wait for her execution. And in the first half of the book, you're kind of like getting to know the family that she's staying with and some of the people she interacts with, and everyone like is treating her really badly because she's accused of being a murderer and everything, and you don't know what really happened the night that this murder happened. And then the second half of the book, you start to learn more about Agnes's past. Agnes is the main character, and what actually happened that night. And that was what I found a lot more interesting. So I definitely enjoyed the second half more than the first half. But I just didn't emotionally connect to the characters and what was going on. And while the ending was very sad, I didn't cry. But I do think it's a really interesting book. So if the plot of it, the historical inspiration of it sounds interesting to you, I definitely recommend it. I also really enjoyed reading the author's note at the end where she talks about some of the research she did and the time she spent in Iceland. I always love reading author notes and acknowledgements and stuff. But yeah, those are the 4 things that I read in February. I'm really glad that my reading momentum has kind of picked up a little bit. Hopefully I can keep it going for forever, but for the next few months. If you have read any of these books that I talked about, let me know down in the comment section what you thought of them. Do you agree with my thoughts? Or you can let me know what maybe your favorite read of February was, any recommendations for me. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.